Holland, one of the wealthiest nations in Europe, is a country under threat. Killer floods have already claimed tens of thousands of lives and thousands of square kilometers. But the Dutch are fighting back, building a series of unique and complex megastructures designed to shut out the sea. Together, they are the biggest, most sophisticated flood defences ever built. The Kingdom of the Netherlands, also known as Holland, is one of the most densely populated countries in Europe. It's also the third biggest agricultural exporter in the world. Land is precious here. The wealth of historic Amsterdam and the status of Rotterdam, the world's largest port, have put Holland on the map. But the Dutch are living life on the brink. Nearly a quarter of their country is below sea level. It's former marshland that's been reclaimed from the fierce and unpredictable North Sea. For centuries, the Dutch have been waging a war with the water, trying to hold on to their land. But as the land dries out, it's slowly sinking. At the same time, climate change means sea levels are rising. Today, the frightening fact is that there's no Western nation more at risk of a watery wipeout than Holland. The Dutch response has been extreme, to build a series of giant barriers to hold back the ocean. These defences now stretch the length of the country, and together are more than twice as long as the Great Wall of China. The structures range from ancient earth dikes to complex sluice gates, giant locks, and this, the ultimate sea protection system. A retractable storm surge barrier that's perhaps the most complex ocean defence ever built. The gates are each almost the size of the Eiffel Tower. When the computer senses danger, 15,000 tons of steel swing shut on the largest ball joints ever made. Without these massive feats of engineering, Holland simply wouldn't exist today. For the Dutch, the constant fear of flooding is a way of life, and the barricades a matter of survival. It's a lesson they've learned the hard way.
My grandmother was killed only a few hundred meters from our place. She lived alone in a small house, and it all collapsed. She was stuck in the roof and she was trapped.
In the last 50 years, the Dutch have spent an unbelievable $2.5 trillion on flood protection. Looking ahead, they've earmarked a further 25 billion over this century. All spent, as they say, to keep their feet dry. But for how long can they hold back the sea?
My whole village, well, you see there's my house, you won't see any window at all, and my whole village will be flooded and inundated.
There may still be worse to come. New evidence is suggesting that this spectacular collection of seawalls may not be enough to save the Netherlands. The combined effects of climate change, sea level rise, and the relentless sinking of their hard-won land may yet prove too great a challenge to combat. Looking at the extraordinary string of megastructures that hold back the water, it may seem the battle has been won. But unfortunately for the Dutch, their war against the elements is far from over.
The ocean is one of the things that's really unknown, and you never know what's going to happen tomorrow, or 1,000 years, or 10,000 years.
So the story is the same along nearly the entire Dutch coastline. 3,500 kilometers of dunes and dams, locks and levees, all built to hold back the water. It's a basic fact of life. If your land is below sea level, as a quarter of modern Holland is, you have to keep the ocean at bay. The problems the Dutch have now began at the end of the last ice age. With the melting of the ice, the sea level rose, creating the North Sea, and with it, hundreds of thousands of acres of coastal swamp. The monster ice sheet had been weighing down the very northern parts of Europe. As it melted, it got lighter, so the landmass has been tilting like a giant seesaw, rising in the north and slowly dipping these coastal zones further down into the sea. It was this slowly sinking tidal peat bog that was to become the Kingdom of the Netherlands. For centuries, the Dutch have been waging a war with nature, fighting to win back land from the sea. Using windmills and pumps, they've drained the coastal bogs and converted them into fertile farmland. Earth walls called dikes surround the farmland and keep the water out.
It all started on a very small scale. Individual landowners felt the need to drain their land, and they were willing to bear the cost for that.
As the saying goes, God created the earth, the Dutch created Holland. By the end of the 19th century, there were some 10,000 windmills draining and reclaiming day and night. Today it houses a population of 16 million people in less than twice the space of New Jersey and possesses some of the most fertile, productive land on the planet. If Holland floods, there's a great deal at stake. Here at the Aalsmeer flower auction, for example, more than 20 million flowers and plants change hands every day. 80% of the produce is homegrown. It's the Wall Street of the horticultural world and a billion-dollar business. And it's the same story in every corner of the Netherlands. Rich, fertile soil, flat, farmable land and easy, efficient water transportation means business is booming, making this tiny country the third largest agricultural exporter in the world, with the busiest seaport on Earth. But for the Dutch, the frightening fact remains that their land is borrowed from the sea. Much of it didn't even exist a few hundred years ago, and most of it is anything up to 6.7 meters below sea level, enough to drown a two-story house. And the water is always threatening to come back. Without the constant draining and massive protective seawalls, this agricultural Eden wouldn't exist today. But unfortunately for the Dutch, becoming the masters at draining land has only added to their flood nightmares. It's been discovered that the drained land sinks 50 centimeters in the last century. Constantly removing the water means the peat and earth dries out, and as it does, it shrinks and sinks. So the irony is, the more successful you are at draining your flooded land, the lower it gets, and the more at risk from flooding.
If the land sinks, then you have to pump more and more water out in order to maintain dry feed.
The 5,000 kilometers of rivers and canals have strained to contain Holland's water flow across the centuries, but the future looks wetter still. The forecasts predict that the amount of water coming at the Dutch from the sea, the rivers and the sky is only going to increase.
For the future we expect more intensive rainfall. At the same time we expect higher sea levels, and higher seawater levels plus more wind will mean more attacks on the flood defenses.
With over 2,400 kilometers of defensive dikes under attack, collapses happen. January 1995, and it's raining long and hard across Europe. By the 1st of February, 250,000 people, 300,000 cattle and 1 million pigs have been evacuated. Not only is it a disaster for the Dutch victims who simply can't get flood insurance, but it shatters any confidence that the nation is now safe from the water. Controlling the rivers and blockading the sea is a complex battle against the forces of nature, one that the Dutch have been fighting for generations. With each disaster, their ingenuity is tested, and technological possibilities are pushed to the limit. Devastating floods a century ago prompt the construction of a 30-kilometre-long dam, built against the odds using sheer brute strength. In the 50s, the worst disaster in living memory triggers a program of massive flood defences that are both unparalleled in scale and revolutionary in design. Today, as the rising waters threaten once again, the Dutch face the prospect of a future in which they must either sink or swim. The next generation of megastructures could be whole cities that take to the water instead of fighting it. In 1916, the stakes are first raised as devastating storm floods in the north of Holland sweep towards Amsterdam. They wipe out everything in their path, destroying crops and decimating livestock, just when the First World War is already creating drastic food shortages. If you don't drown, you'll starve. The Dutch have lost to the ocean once too often. To fight back, they embark on a megastructure of unprecedented dimensions, one of the world's longest dams, to shut out the sea before it strikes again. Tens of thousands of lives have been lost to flooding in the Netherlands. In 1916, the miseries of the First World War are inflicting hardships all over Europe, and the last thing the Dutch need is a flood. But in January, that's just what they get. Food shortages bring the threat of starvation, and livelihoods are ruined.
A substantial area north of Amsterdam was flooded, including the house and the workshop of my grandparents. Their stockpile of wood, they started floating. And given the wind direction, these tree trunks were hammering against the house. And 2 days later, the entire house and the workshop were flattened.
There's been talk of a giant dam in the north of Holland for over 100 years, but this latest disaster is the catalyst for building what still stands as one of the longest sea barriers in the world.
It seems that there has to be a disaster before politics springs into action.
The plan is to build a 30-kilometre wall right across the stormy North Sea, holding back the ocean and at the same time turning the water behind it into a freshwater lake with no tides and no risk of flooding. It's inspired, ambitious, and many think impossible.
Well, at the time it was a daring operation. The specialists were not sure as to whether or not this it could be guaranteed that it could actually be built. But it was at the edge of the technological capabilities.
In 1927, work begins on one of the longest, most expensive dam constructions in the world. The huge scale of the project and a work site deep below the raging waters of the North Sea means it's a superhuman challenge right from the start. First, the basic building materials must be gathered. These consist of sand, clay, and rocks. From experience, the Dutch have already discovered that glacial boulder clay is the best primary material for a dam. Fortunately, it's in plentiful supply, just from dredging the seabed on site. But the rocks are a big problem. Vast quantities have to be imported from Belgium and Germany. A series of docks and wharfs are specially built. With only primitive technology available, the work is extremely labour-intensive. At its peak, up to 7,000 labourers are housed on site in newly built barracks along the coast. The scale of the operation is simply mind-boggling. 105 flatboats, 72 tugboats and 73 barges are commissioned to transport the materials around the worksite. Construction then begins by depositing the boulder clay into the open sea. As it builds up near to the surface, the trench is filled with sand and then covered with more clay. The surface of the structure is then reinforced with a covering of willow wood mattresses. It's back-breaking work. For the underwater section, these are weighed down using the imported rocks, which are placed on one by hand. Even as the tide comes in, construction must continue. As long as you can stand up and pass the boulders, you keep working. When the water gets too deep, you jump into the boats with the rocks and carry on. It's relentless and exhausting. Using sheer force of will and a great deal of sweat, the closure dike grows across the North Sea. As the gap gets narrower, the water rushing by the construction team gets faster. And as the tide turns, it also switches direction every few hours. First dragging the workers in one direction as the tide floods in, then in the other as it rushes back out to sea. But at last, 5 years after work began, the final bucketful of boulder clay is dropped in the last remaining gap. A few brave workers are the first to cross to the other side. At 1:02 on the afternoon of May the 28th, 1932, the last rock is placed in the wall, completing one of the longest dams on Earth. It still stands today as one of the world's longest sea barriers. But this mega dam is just the beginning of the Dutch's audacious engineering project. The second phase calls upon their other skill, land reclamation. Without the danger of floods, new land can now be reclaimed around the edges of the man-made lake. Within 36 years of the barrier being finished, they've reclaimed an incredible 1,600 square kilometers. With an awesome dam in place across the north of their country and plenty of new land, you'd think the Dutch could relax. But down south in the delta, things are not as they should be, and out in the North Sea, trouble is brewing. Early 1953, and in the depths of a stormy winter's night, the biggest catastrophe in living memory is about to unleash. With the coast of North Holland now protected by the giant new closure dam, the Dutch think they can take their eyes off the ocean. They're wrong. It's late January 1953, and a storm is building that no one is prepared for. Out in the North Sea, what's called a storm surge is beginning to form. As the high winds blow across the surface of the sea, they push up a growing swell of water ahead of them. This bulging tide gathers momentum and builds up as it pushes inland. When it hits the coastline, it can turn into a wall of water as much as 7.5 meters high or more. It engulfs everything in its path. On the last day of January, a northerly gale sweeps water from the North Sea down between Scotland and Norway, directly for the coast of Holland. It's the beginnings of a disaster that will spawn the biggest flood protection system in the world. Nico Poortvliet recalls the events of the night only too well.
I was a 4-year-old boy. In the middle of the night, people They came to our house and they cried, "Hey, get out of there, it's dangerous."
It's already high tide, but the funneling effect of the sea combines to produce the highest water levels ever observed off the coast of northern Europe. It soon becomes a storm surge. Most people are sleeping peacefully in their homes. Floods are not forecast. As the storm surge slams the length of the southern coastline, it proves too much for the ancient, weakened barriers, and the full force of the North Sea erupts inland.
The dike collapsed and the water came as a rolling thunder in the dark up to us. And the only thing we could do, my dad could do, was go back into the house. It made a hole in the roof from inside so we could get out. And there we sat there for, well, let's say 6-7 hours.
67 dikes are destroyed, breached in 400 places. The sea penetrates many kilometers inland. Over 200,000 livestock drown in the wave of water that sweeps through the countryside.
It was, of course, horrifying, because when they sat there, they saw dead cows and dead pigs flowing along. It's all very, very horrifying.
As the icy floodwaters rise, people have no way to escape from their houses.
My grandmother was killed only a few hundred meters from our place. She lived alone in a small house. She was stuck in the roof and the house collapsed and she was trapped in.
1,835 people are killed, trapped in their homes or drowned trying to swim in the freezing floodwaters. 72,000 people are evacuated, thousands are left homeless, and many livelihoods destroyed. It's months before the last breach is closed, but it's clear that Holland's simple old defences can no longer protect the country from disaster. Devastated but undefeated by the disaster, a massive new flood protection strategy is now proposed, called the Delta Project. It's an incredibly ambitious concept, to build a string of defensive sea walls that block off southern estuaries. It's designed to shorten the vulnerable coastline by 780 kilometers. And shut out the sea for good. A series of concrete seawalls are built to plug the vulnerable inlets. But 14 years into the mega build, a devastating discovery threatens the existence of the whole project. The sea life behind the new barriers is dying out. Blocking out the ocean shuts off the saltwater flow and wipes out the marine wildlife. It's also killing the highly profitable fishing and seafood industry. This can't be allowed to happen. Locals and the fishing industry take to the water in an environmental protest. For an engineering project of this scale to change direction halfway through is virtually unheard of. But the existing plans are scrapped and a daunting new challenge thrown at the designers. Produce a flexible barrier, one that can shut off the storm surge at any moment, but still allow the 1,100 million cubic meters of water to flow through the tidal estuary each tide. The solution is as simple as it is revolutionary. The traditional solid dam is abandoned in favour of the new groundbreaking concept of a raised storm surge barrier. It's a system of 62 steel gates strung between huge concrete support blocks. Normally the gates are open and the water can flow freely in and out. But when a storm surge threatens, they can be lowered at the touch of a button, and the land and people behind them kept safe from flooding. The environmentalists, the fishing industry, and the survivors of the '53 storm flood all welcome the new high-tech answer. In 1979, the complex construction challenge begins. The barrier needs to stand perfectly stable in the high-velocity currents and on the shifting sands of the seabed. Using a giant flume tank, extensive tests are carried out to calculate the wave forces it will be subjected to, because any significant movement in the structure could upset alignment and cause the floodgates to jam, rendering the barrier useless in the face of a deadly storm surge. The old technique of using woven willow to secure the underwater surfaces is the inspiration for a new high-tech solution. Giant plastic mattresses are filled with gravel, then unrolled along the length of the sea wall using specially built barges. The result is a 36 centimetre thick, 200 metre wide layered carpet, creating a smooth, solid foundation for the new barrier. Next, they must create piers strong enough to allow the 62 huge steel gates to be strung between them. These have to bear a weight of up to 500 tons and the infamous and unpredictable storm surge. These 12-storey hollow concrete monoliths are the solution, combining strength with buoyancy. Built in a specially constructed dry dock, each one takes a year and a half to produce, with over 30 piers being constructed simultaneously. When they're finished, the dry dock is flooded in order to float all 65 piers into position. Each one must be guided to its final resting position to within a few centimetres of accuracy. Once positioned, the pier is lowered onto the seabed. Then, the hollow piers are filled with sand and fixed firmly in position with 5 million tons of rock, all carefully placed to ensure total stability. The 62 movable steel sluice gates can then be lowered into position. They're each individually made to fit the exact profile of the estuary at each point along the barrier. The largest gates in the deepest water weigh in at almost 500 tons each. Once the barrier is complete, the final touch is the addition of a roadway deck that joins up the coastal islands with a new highway. The result is a barrier that shuts out the sea, opens up transportation, and is the largest tidal sea barrier in the world. But now climate change is rewriting the rules. The prediction is for larger storms more often.
People like my mother, they can hardly forget what happened then. Every time it's storming now, she thinks, will it be high enough? Will it be strong enough? Will we face a disaster like in '53? And I can say 1,000 times, Mom, you shouldn't be afraid. We are safe now. Every time she thinks, well, is that true? Is that true?
With the final barrier complete, Holland's delta area is now secured. There's just one last vital gap to close in Holland's sea wall. But in this case, the challenge seems impossible, because here there must be no obstruction whatsoever. The new waterway is the entrance to Rotterdam, the Dutch superport. It serves 350 million Europeans and handles over 100 million tons of cargo a year for America and Asia. The waterway must remain open to shipping. But if a flood roars down this open channel, it will threaten over 1 million lives. And the next deadly storm surge could strike any day now. The solution to this dilemma is the most spectacular megastructure of them all. These extraordinary-looking constructions are Holland's latest megastructure. At nearly 300 meters long and 22 meters high, they're the answer to a problem that seemed to defy solution. Rotterdam is the busiest seaport in the world. But this jewel in Holland's economic crown is also its Achilles heel. To blockade the shipping superhighway with flood defences would be economic suicide. But if a storm surge sweeps up this 360-metre wide channel, it will threaten Holland's industrial heart and place millions of lives at risk. So how, on such an enormous scale, can you stop a storm surge racing in from the North Sea without stopping the ships? Yet again, the Dutch have come up with an extraordinary megastructure that's turned the heads of the engineering world.
So they came up with the idea of some large floating structures that could precisely be floated in place and locked in place on really a moment's notice. So this is an unbelievable accomplishment, and it's really a credit to engineering that something like this could even be done. It was doubtful that it could ever be built. Many people doubted that the Dutch could ever do this.
The concept of creating two giant floating gates is both ingenious and daring. Normally open and out of the way of shipping, if floodwaters threaten, these hollow gates can swing swiftly into position. Because they float, the giant gates are under less stress. Once in place, valves in the lower sections of the gates are opened. They fill with water and sink, closing off the new waterway the moment a storm surge is imminent. But for this megastructure to work, the gates must lower onto a flat surface. Extensive trials are performed in a test tank to determine the best materials for the foundations. The challenge is that as the gates close, the gap shrinks. The water rushes faster, threatening to tear apart the foundations. So the designers decide to build their own customized bed. This is perhaps the most spectacular feat of the entire mammoth project. They dig deeper than a two-story building and then build the floor back up in layers of sand, gravel and rocks until a perfect foundation is in place. The permeable layers allow some water to filter through them, reducing the force of flow under the gates so these foundations don't get washed away. Then, 64 630-ton concrete blocks are fitted together on top of this base to form a solid ledge. When the gates are not in use, this ledge becomes buried in silt. But as the closed gates lower onto the bed, the rushing water that gets squeezed underneath through the closing gap blasts them clean, creating a perfect watertight fit. With the design determined, construction begins on the Mammoth project, with teams working around the clock to complete the crucial defences. The bases for the gate's hinges are critical to the structure. Together, they are capable of handling a force of 70,000 tons, and during the heaviest of storms, they'll need to. The ball joints are cast in one of Europe's largest steel foundries. 10 meters in diameter, not only are these the most exact ever manufactured, they're also the largest. Each one is a structure the size of a house, built with the precision of a watch. They arrive at the barrier by sea, and are fitted into their colossal concrete bases. The trusses, made of up to 9 centimetre thick steel tubing, are each assembled section by section on site. It takes 160 hours to weld each joint, with the work done in a controlled environment inside protective tents to avoid any contamination of the welds. The whole arm will only be as strong as its weakest weld. When finished, each gate is almost as long as the Eiffel Tower. These 300-metre-long arms are the final part of the most complex sea protection system ever built. The linchpin of the whole project is the computer-controlled decision support system, codenamed BOS. Only this computer can decide if the gates are to close. It receives constantly updated weather and wave height information from ships at sea, remote buoys and weather stations. The decision to close the gates relies solely on the computer predictions. People can't decide when or if to close the gates. The decision is too important to risk any human error. They must wait on a computerized hair trigger. In 2002, the gates get their biggest test yet. 27th of October 2002, and the water level predictions aren't looking good. A prolonged period of rain has filled the rivers to bursting. At the same time, an area of low pressure is moving down the North Sea. BOS, the automated barrier closing system, is predicting a sea height 3 meters, almost 10 feet, in excess of the maximum safety level. It's red alert time. BOS automatically triggers the barrier closing sequence. At T-4 hours, a warning goes out to all shipping. At this time, the dry docks where the gates normally rest begin flooding, ready to float them out into position. T-2 hours, all shipping is halted. If you're a vessel in port, you stay put. If you're out at sea, good luck. At T0, the gates should begin to close, but this time, they don't. BOS has been crunching the numbers, and the new storm surge is now 2.99 meters. That's still a wall of water way over the heads of most people, but it's not enough to trigger closure.
We did all the preparations, but we didn't close the barrier because there was 1 centimeter shortage of water.
The computer has held its nerve, trusting the forecasting data and aborting the closure sequence. The reason it's left entirely to a computer is that a human being, particularly one with a family or home the other side of the barrier, might act differently.
If you think the water is that high that your house is going to flood, you close the barrier. Computer don't.
The shipping companies, the lifeblood of Rotterdam, are happy that an unemotional machine decides whether or not to shut down their main waterway. The barrier management put their trust in BOS. If the worst should happen, a storm surge will be halted and the people and businesses behind them protected. So with the last opening in Holland's North Sea wall now closed, surely it must be time to relax. Finally, are the Dutch safe? The answer, yet again, is no. In the latest cruel twist, climate change and sea level rise are now threatening everything the Dutch have done so far. But once more, the response has been extraordinary. Over the centuries, the Dutch have fought constantly to hold on to their precious land. In the face of each new disaster, they've developed sophisticated and groundbreaking solutions to achieve a string of incredible engineering feats. Without this North Sea wall, the Netherlands would be around half the size it is today. The massive Delta Plan has reduced the risk of severe flooding to a mere once in every 4,000 years. It has culminated in a system of sea walls that combine ingenuity with innovation and have successfully completed the world's largest ocean defence network. With the last barrier now in place, Rotterdam and its hinterland are protected behind the most spectacular megastructure of them all. But change is in the air, and for the Dutch, it's not good. Their country has been swallowed by the sea before, and the melting of the ice caps is raising sea levels all over the world again. Climate change is whipping up more violent storms. As rainfall increases, now Europe's rivers are filling to bursting and creating a new risk of flooding. The barriers built to shut out the sea won't work inland, so the Dutch have a radical plan to stay in control. During extreme flood situations, they are actually going to give back some of their hard-won land to the water, but they're going to choose which areas flood and which don't. They're going to break the levees deliberately and create inlets to flood selected areas of the countryside.
When it starts to rain and you see the water levels rising in the floodplain and it's getting higher, and you get, well, we switch on German TV and you see there's coming more, the rain is getting heavier, then you get worried.
In some cases, they even plan to sacrifice whole villages.
Well, if the water comes in, it will rise to an expected level of 5 meters, which will mean that the windows of my house over there, you won't see them at all. Only the top of the roof is visible.
3 of Europe's major rivers flow into Holland. To act as Europe's storm drain in times of extreme rainfall, the Dutch are having to nominate these unlucky pockets of their country to go under.
These areas were chosen, first of all, because they are close to the border with Germany, where the water is coming from. These are the areas that theoretically would flood first anyway.
The second reason these zones were chosen is because they're less densely populated than other areas, but unfortunately, none of Holland is uninhabited. Normally surrounded by a protective dike to keep the water out, now thousands of cubic meters of river water will be diverted into these sacrificial zones, submerging the fields and villages.
There'll be ample warning and they'll have time to evacuate their homes. And then there will be arrangements, of course, to pay for all the damages.
It's radical, but ultimately may prove more cost-effective than building extensive new flood protection schemes.
I'm afraid most policy at the end of the day will be decided with a calculator.
But having fought so long and hard for their land, are the Dutch now really going to concede defeat? The answer, of course, is no. Building on their expertise as hydraulic engineers, they're now embarking on a series of amazing new ideas to fight the floods. If things do go badly, the Dutch are going to be ready. Looking to the future, the designers are developing a new floating world. Floating homes or houseboats are not a novel idea. But, as always, the Dutch are pushing the possibilities to new extremes. These houses in the east of Holland are the shape of things to come. Their design is both simple and ingenious. The constructions are built on large concrete basins like giant square barges. These are loosely attached to mooring poles that allow the houses to rise and fall with the water level. Fitted out in lightweight wood and plastic, the top balances perfectly on the hollow, floating concrete base. And it's not only floating homes that the Dutch are developing. The possibilities are as endless as the Dutch's ingenuity. A prototype floating road has already been built, using similar technology to the houses. It floats on pontoons, encasing giant lumps of buoyant polystyrene, which are then reinforced with steel. The structure is assembled from transportable modules that are locked together on site. Once installed, the pontoons are anchored to the bed to keep them steady. The completed road can even be fitted with a floating remote-controlled drawbridge to avoid blocking the waterway to shipping. The people of the Netherlands have always used cutting-edge technology to overcome the tremendous forces that challenge its very existence. The dams, dikes and giant gates of their North Sea wall are the crowning example of Dutch engineering skills. There are no people on Earth more inventive and experienced in water management. But that's taught them better than any nation that you can't take nature for granted. Prompted by extreme loss of land and life, the Dutch have successfully completed the world's largest ocean defence network. For now, they have tamed the fierce North Sea. They have shown courage and ingenuity, but perhaps the greatest lesson they've learned is that when you compete with nature, you shouldn't always play to win.